Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Carrie Ann Koza. I head up the Global Operations and Member Experience in Renaissance Executive Forums, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Expert Insight platform and to connect with this incredible community of leaders within Executive Forums and throughout the wider global business community. In partnership with EY, we are coming together to bring you the latest trends and insights. And today, I am very excited to be exploring the future enterprise. How can today's leaders realize tomorrow's opportunities? We are here with EY thought leaders John DeYoung and Priyanka Srinivasan, Insights Directors for EYQ, a global EY think tank that convenes, creates, and connects around the question, what's after, what's next? John is the EY Global Markets EYQ Global Insights Director. He is a thought leader focused on disruption, sustainability, and mega trends. He leads the Disruption Readiness Cities and Natural Resources agenda for EYQ. John has had diverse global roles over his nearly 20-year career at EY, and his work at EYQ has been informed by extensive exploration of business issues and trends in VC, entrepreneurship, clean tech, and energy. Priyanka is a thought leader focused on technology disruption, innovation, and impact on the human experience. She is a business influencer and innovation strategist and has helped companies strategically and tactically leverage emerging technologies to drive business transformation, new revenue streams, higher profitability, and more robust competitive advantage. She explores trends and their impact on the way the world does business and the ways in which we live, work, and play. Welcome, John and Priyanka, and thank you for being with us today. As always, we are recording this Expert Insight, and it will be available to all of our members in our digital global resource library. We also invite everyone to send comments and questions via the comment section as we move through today's presentation. We will reserve about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for open question and answer. With that said, please, John, Priyanka, take it away.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. Let me just share my screen. So first, it's a real delight to be here, having this opportunity to present the CEO Imperative study to the Renaissance Executive Forum's global community. It's a real privilege for us to share these insights, and we're going to spend the next few minutes, the next hour with you, talking about business transformation. So how the CEOs of the world's largest companies are feeling the impact of business trends, how they're responding in terms of changing their organizations, what some of those gaps in their ability to respond are, and then how we see global corporations and CEOs need to respond to those trends and how they can bridge those capability gaps. So first, a word about the CEO Imperative study, something that we've been doing for a few years now. This is actually our third edition, something that we do every 2 years. Now, our first CEO Imperative looked at the need for corporations to be able to disrupt or be disrupted in light of industry convergence and fast scaling startups. And so we asked global CEOs to self-assess on their capabilities in terms of innovation and leadership and culture and external sensing related to disruption. Then, in light of growing stakeholder expectations for CEOs to respond to global challenges, we did our second CEO Imperative, getting the CEOs' views, their investor views, and their board views on the role of CEOs in large corporations in addressing things like climate change or income inequality or gender inequality or racial disparities. And we found that all three constituencies, CEOs and board members and investors, were aligned on the need for CEOs to take a stand. And now this third study takes the perspective that with the imperative new capabilities and new expectations, there is an imperative for a new enterprise. For a number of years, a number of forces, whether digital or the future of work or the sustainability imperative or new stakeholder expectations, have been reshaping the enterprise. With the pandemic, those forces arrived in full force simultaneously. And now business transformation, delaying business transformation, is no longer an option. Now is really the time to acquire that DNA, those key characteristics of the future enterprise. The CEO Imperative is centered on a global survey of CEOs of Forbes Global 2000 companies. So these are companies that range in revenue from $1 billion to $50 billion or more. Geographically, the 305 CEOs we surveyed represent the Forbes Global 2000 in distribution, and with strong sector representation in things like manufacturing, consumer, energy, financial services, and tech. In terms of some top-level takeaways to set the scene, our point of view is that this is really a moment of truth for CEOs. With the pandemic, long-standing trends arrived together, shifting the need for business transformation from something that was before perhaps important to something that's now urgent. We're seeing what we call thriving and surviving companies rapidly diverging in terms of their revenue growth. So now is the time really to determine, are you thriving or surviving in your market? And then do you have an opportunity to catch up, leap ahead, or to outdistance your competitors? We're seeing CEOs feel that urgency to transform, and they're pivoting to investment in growth and transformation. But key gaps stand in the way, and we'll discuss those. Everything from data and data trust to culture to climate to digital transformation. And we've identified 5 attributes that stand out as essential elements of the new DNA for business success. Data as a strategic and operational enabler, new talent models and structures, ecosystem orchestration, the need to focus on long-term value, and leadership anchored in the human imperative. And to close those gaps and acquire those attributes, we see 3 interconnected drivers: humans at center, technology at speed, and innovation at scale. So let's dive into the findings. So first I mentioned thrivers and survivors. So one of the things that we did is we looked at our respondents in terms of their revenue growth. And in FY20, we identified 3 different groups. One group actually grew in FY20 during the worst of the pandemic. Those are the thriving companies. One group saw flat revenues, not much divergence one way or the other. We're calling these maintaining companies. And then we saw another group that saw significant revenue declines, and we're calling those surviving companies. And then we looked back 3 years and calculated their revenue growth, which you can see on the left side of this chart. And the thriving companies were already ahead 3 years ago in terms of revenue growth. But then, as part of the survey, we asked them to project their revenue growth over the next 3 years. And you can see that the divergence, the gap between the thriving and the rest is set to grow even more over the next 3 years. And so for companies, the question is are you a thriver or a survivor? And what's the opportunity to level up or leap ahead? So what are thriving companies doing differently from surviving companies? Well, both groups are focused on transformation, but the thriving companies are more focused on pursuing growth. So pursuing significant new opportunities, changing their products and service mix, spending more on transformation. Surviving companies, on the other hand, are more focused on reducing their spend and protecting what they have. So significant headcount reductions or cost reductions, much lower levels of opportunity, pursuing opportunities or product and service mix changes. And so in that context, global CEOs feel the urgency to transform. 61% plan to undertake a major new transformation initiative, and 68% of CEOs plan a major investment in data and technology in the next 12 months. And 65% expect to spend more on transformation over the next 3 years than they have in the prior 3 years. And this is key. Only 22% say transformation will be paid for. These transformation initiatives will be paid for by cost reduction. So these are new investments in business transformation that are not going to be offset necessarily by cuts. And here's really the key thing, is that 46% of the respondents have investor support to make strategic investments, even if those investments reduce near-term EPS and dividends. So those 46% that have investor support to make some really long-term investments now that are not going to have immediate ROI. Conversely, the other half could be disadvantaged in that they have to show that ROI more immediately. One of the things we asked the CEOs is what are the trends that are driving the most change in your organization? And perhaps no surprise, tech and digital innovation and customer expectations came up as the leading trends. But while these trends are not new, they're newly urgent, as you can see, or we've seen by the market share caused by the pandemic, the shift to digital, the shift to remote work, the changing customer preferences. You can also see here the global supply chains shifts coming into play, and then down the line for things like new business models, stakeholder capitalism, distributed workforce, sustainability, and geopolitics. Now the balance changes by sector. So energy naturally energy companies naturally are seeing a much greater influence by the sustainability imperative. Finance companies, now that ESG metrics and ESG risk are coming to the fore, are being driven by stakeholder capitalism. Consumer, no surprise, are seeing customer expectations come to the fore. Then we asked, okay, given those trends, what areas in the enterprise do you expect to make the most changes in the next 3 years? And here on the left, we see what the CEOs responded. So risk, innovation, and capital allocation decision-making were the top three. And then supply chain and business models, product and service portfolio, and then a series of people and talent and leadership, org structure and culture and purpose, call them the human elements. Then we asked one step further, okay, so what are your priorities, your transformation priorities in those areas? And here I think we'll see some priorities that make a lot of sense given the pandemic and this disruption that we've seen. So here are just for the top three. So in risk management, CEOs want more data-driven risk analytics. They want more focus on enterprise resilience and existential risks. And they want to increase the importance of ESG factors and risk assessments. So innovation processes, they want to innovate faster, accelerate idea generation, trials, assessment. They want to move the organization to be more innovative and risk-taking, and they want to get closer to the customer. And in capital allocation decision-making, they want consistency, efficiency, visibility, and speed. But underlying all of this is really a focus on the human dimensions. So 68% of CEOs have at least one people-related transformation priority, call it whether it's talent, leadership, organizational structure, culture, and purpose. And this makes sense because people are either the catalyst of transformation or the potential impediment to transformation. You have to bring your people along, you have to bring your culture along in the transformation journey. As part of the survey, we benchmarked the companies in several areas, and one of those areas was in generating value from data. And what we found is that data is a key challenge, especially data trust. And we asked, which of the following statements apply to your organization? We deliver timely insights for better internal and customer outcomes. 51% of CEOs said, yeah, that applies. Our risk assessment is adequately data-driven, 49%. Fewer say we have seamless data access enterprise-wide. Fewer say we combine machine and human data effectively, less than half. But where there's a real gap is in the statement, customers trust us with their data. Only 34% of CEOs affirm that, which is kind of a striking number. So while cybersecurity and concerns about privacy and AI are certainly key drivers of this, so is a disappointment that a lot of customers feel about their experiences, their data-driven experiences, and the delivery on the promises that companies are making about data usage. So as companies think about business reimagination, creating new business models, creating new customer propositions, data is at the center of this. And if customers don't trust companies with their data, it's going to be a barrier. And culture plays into this. So similarly, we asked the CEOs to answer a series of respond to a series of statements around culture. And culture is critical to innovation, it's critical to agility, it's critical to being able to move your organization in a direction. And culture being at the center of people, being created by people, can be both an accelerator or a barrier to things like agility and innovation and diversity. So, for example, one of our CEOs, going back to the data example, said, you can hire data scientists, you can create a data innovation center, but if you don't create a culture that uses data differently, you're not going to realize the return on your investment. And so when we asked the CEOs, can you affirm that you make decisions with agility? So 55% said yes. Slightly fewer said we have a clear purpose shared by all employees, and fewer still said we maintain purpose and culture with remote and distributed teams. But here's where you get into the the culture barriers to transformation. Only 35% said that their organization embraces continuous transformation. Only 32% said mid-level leadership models shared purpose and vision, and only 28% said we create diverse and inclusive teams at all levels. And that's in the organization. In the C-suite, we said, what's the single most important change you would like to make to your C-suite? Well, more streamlined decision-making, said the CEO, is 32%, or new roles for changing market imperatives. But very few said greater diversity, and even fewer still said to bring in talent from outside the company for new perspectives. So CEOs are prioritizing more efficient decision-making in the C-suite over diversity. So given these culture challenges and given these priorities in the C-suite, is it time to appoint a chief culture officer to drive the culture that's going to help drive transformation? We also assessed the companies around ecosystems. Companies are increasingly focused on developing and orchestrating ecosystems around them to develop new customer propositions, to solve innovation challenges, to go to market, to respond to and take advantage of industry convergence. But what we're finding is that only a minority are actually making significant investments to do so. So we see that 50% of respondents say we make forecasts based on the contributions of ecosystem partnerships. 47% of minority say we're making significant investments to manage ecosystem business partnerships. But only a third, 31%, say we have an external ecosystem of business partnerships as part of our strategy. So it's still a lot is coming from the bottom up rather than the top down. And only 17% say one person is the clear owner of cultivating and managing ecosystem business partnerships. And while these results might seem on the low side, if you'd actually made the same assessment a couple of years ago, the numbers probably would have been much lower. So while there's a lot of work to do on ecosystems, there is positive change as global corporations pick up and begin to execute on ecosystems. Now, long-term value. So creating value for the whole range of stakeholders. So customers, shareholders, society, creating financial value has become an increasing focus in the market. It's become an increasing focus of investors. And so what we did is we looked at a number of questions and responses in the survey and assigned them as either intentions that the CEOs want to do or actual actions that the CEOs have done to drive long-term value. So whether it's for customers, society, or shareholders or other stakeholders. And what we found is that there's a gap between intention and action. So if everyone's intention was high and their actions were high, they'd all be clustered in the upper right. And what we find is that they're really clustered in the middle, and that actions don't match intentions, and even worse, a lot of times the intentions are low and the actions are low as well. And there's some good reasons for this, in the sense that there's not necessarily a common understanding of what long-term value means. There are different frameworks that could be applied, and CEOs don't necessarily know where to start or how to progress the goal of long-term value in their organization. And one of the gaps that we identified, another of the gaps that we identified, is related to climate and sustainability. So we saw before that only 26% of CEOs said that the sustainability imperative is one of the top three drivers of transformation in their organization. Obviously, energy is the big one, and manufacturing a little bit less so. But in the other industries, it's quite low. And then in climate risk, there's a lack of awareness, as you can see here. because CEOs say, when we ask them, where are you going to focus your C-suite differentially? So where are those going to be? What are those areas of increased C-suite focus? Only 26%, again, maybe the same 26% said they're going to focus it on climate risk. And in other sectors, like technology and finance, that percentage is quite low. Only energy is really focused on energy. CEOs are focused on directing their C-suite towards energy. So that brings me to this full chart of CEO priorities for their C-suite. So we asked, okay, what are those areas that your C-suite needs to focus on to drive growth? And digital transformation is at the top. Digital transformation really remains unfinished business. This is partly because prior efforts and initiatives were one-off, or maybe they were sort of limited in scope. But what the pandemic showed is that digital transformation needs to be continued, but more than that, it needs to be continuous. The pace of change, the pace of technology change is so great you can't have just a single transformation. Long-term value comes up as the second priority overall, 47%, and that shows how important this idea of long-term value and creating value for stakeholders broadly, not just shareholders, has become. And then you see some really interesting divergences and different areas of focus in the different sectors. And so technology is focused on, technology CEOs say their C-suites need to focus on AI, data science, and cybersecurity. And a third of them say quantum computing. Energy, geopolitics comes up much more than other sectors. And in manufacturing, it's long-term value. So while the overall numbers point to digital transformation and long-term value, when you get into the sectors, there are some interesting differences. So then we wanted to probe in terms of what they thought were, what are the key characteristics, both of future effective leaders, but also of future successful enterprises. So we gave them three choices for characteristics of effective leaders. So one, the top two, leads with compassion, and compassion comes from empathy, sets an example of experimentation and risk-taking, drives a transformative mindset. Then just slightly down the list, takes time to think the unthinkable, and by that we mean think outside the normal bounds of your business about possible futures and possible events, and makes data-driven decisions. Interestingly, however, given the focus on long-term value that we just saw, fosters trust and stakeholders' confidence, is only 21% said that, and that's an interesting gap, especially given the data trust gap that we saw earlier. And then for the most important characteristic of the successful future enterprise, we gave them one choice, and the top response was focused on long-term value, 26%. The next one was embedded in ecosystems, 21%, and you can see how the rest fall out. Some said it was more data and technology driven, some said human-centered or low carbon and sustainable, or self-disrupting and innovative. And there are some, regional differences. In Asia Pac, for example, data and technology driven was more important. In Europe and EMEA, long-term value is more important, and the Americas was somewhere in between. And I think a good quote to kind of sum up this first section is that the new model requires leaders who can create an environment that unleashes human magic, and that's from Hubert Joly, the former CEO of Best Buy. And so we've talked a lot about the what of transformation. So what's driving transformation, what our CEO is focused on in terms of the change, what are the gaps. And now we're going to talk more about the how. So how can we overcome those gaps, and what are the attributes that how can companies acquire the attributes of the future enterprise? So with that, let me hand it over to Priyanka to take us through the next section.
Thank you, John. Again, pleasure to be here and walk you through our work here. So let me just try to take what John said and then bring us into the how exactly do we go about this transformation. I think, as John set up in the beginning, the pandemic has accelerated and compounded forces that were already starting to reframe and recast the purpose structure of enterprises. And what we're seeing now, as the pandemic sort of continues its course and we're sort of hopefully coming out on the other end, is the future is much more dynamic, and it will require companies and their CEOs to adopt a mindset of continuous transformation, and think about how operationally, from a business model perspective, from a talent perspective, how are you going to embrace this dynamism, and what characteristics are going to be key to organizing your strategy around. And so as we went through the study and heard what CEOs of the biggest companies in the world had to say, what it really came down to there are 5 main attributes that will shape the DNA for business success in the future. Starting off with data, and this is really no surprise to any of us, right? Data is a strategic and operational enabler. But I think what we have to recognize now is that data is becoming the new factor of production, and that requires a completely different perspective on how companies look to wield data. So I think it's really important that CEOs recognize, and they do, that data science is going to be a key differentiator in the next 5 years for the most successful companies. That the most competitive companies in the next 5 years will be defined by delivering data-driven experiences, but at the same time they have this gap where customers don't trust them with their data, as John highlighted. And so this trust gap is really a big problem, because it's going to slow down the innovation engine. It's going to stall transformation efforts. If you are not trusted with your customers' data, you cannot serve them in a personalized fashion. And it's now time, it's still early days for the data-driven enterprise, and I think it's now time for CEOs to understand the importance of data and think about how they reframe how to obtain that data, manage that data, use it, and scale it. Because depending on how you manage the life cycle of this data is what's going to earn you the trust and respect of your customers, and in turn, growth, profitability, and so on. So EY have been thinking about is taking a value-first approach, and embedding trust into every part of this life cycle of how data is getting used. By that trusted intelligence that's going to flow through your organization is going to unearth the experiences. It's going to drive the value proposition that customers are going to be delighted by, and that's going to earn you the loyalty of your customers. So we think this is a tremendously important pillar for the DNA of the future enterprise. Next, I think John also touched upon this in some of the data that we showed you. Talent is becoming extraordinarily important because the nature of how and where we work is changing, right? And that's been happening for years, but obviously the pandemic has just accelerated it tremendously. And we're seeing that the CEOs in our survey population, they recognize that empathy and soft skills are going to be key to management capabilities in the next 5 years. They see that we're going to need some new performance metrics and rewards mechanism to onboard, promote, to do onboarding, promotion, and leadership planning, succession planning. They see that small autonomous teams working together in a flat organization structure will deliver the best outcomes. But how do you get there? What is it going to require, right? And I go back to this ethos of the continuous transformation mindset, because if you're going to live in a more dynamic future, your employees are going to have to also embrace that uncertainty and be able to pivot on a dime, to be nimble, be resilient in the face of relentless change. And so embracing that mindset of continuous transformation requires that you enable them to change quickly, to give them the tools and the infrastructure necessary, and the risk taking ability necessary to thrive in this dynamic future. And then, of course, it's about attracting diverse talent and being able to upskill and reskill your workforce, the existing workforce, to meet the challenges of the. And so really, it's not just the CEOs, but also the chief human resources officer to refresh and rethink what is your talent strategy, what new metrics and organizational structures will work for you to create that agility that will be required for your workforce to embrace continuous transformation and to deliver on it, which we as sort of the second of these pillars of successful future enterprises. Next, I think we've talked again about the role of ecosystems. So making ecosystems an essential part of your enterprise strategy is going to be essential to realizing the opportunities that are coming from the erosion of industry boundaries that we're seeing. And yes, the majority of CEOs do recognize that the ability to lead and manage ecosystems will find successful leadership teams. But how do you do this? How do you go about this? And part of it is about looking beyond your industry boundaries, looking for partnerships that you wouldn't traditionally think of, putting yourself in that unthinkable mindset. And then another part of it is, and we are seeing this in the market, is the idea of competition, the idea of actually partnering with your competitors for certain specific products or areas, and making that as a part of your strategy. Now, while this is, it's a complex, it's a very complex network, right, for any major enterprise to think about how to not only to participate, but also lead and orchestrate in those ecosystems. And this is where it may be time to think of adding a chief ecosystem officer to take ownership of this strategy and to deliver those outcomes. The sort of the fourth pillar that we see of the successful future enterprise, and this should again come as no surprise given the first part of this presentation, is the focus on long-term stakeholder value. And this has come across as a cross-cutting priority across the entire study. It surfaced as the most important of the future successful enterprise. And even in other parts of the survey, you can see that CEOs agreed that they expect business models to increasingly incorporate circular economy dimensions. They agree that long-term value will be rewarded by the market, and they agree that there will be a global standard for measuring and reporting long-term value creation. John pointed out there is a gap between the intention and the say and the do. And there are a number of reasons for this. A part of it is, this is a relatively new construct in the business world. There are many frameworks out there. There are still, not probably the clearest understanding of how to drive this particular framework to an operational and tactical cadence within the organization. And we at EY recognize that this is not easy. And one of the things we are starting to evangelize is sort of thinking about long-term value across four dimensions. One is the financial long-term value, which of course is very important for the existence of a company. Customer long-term value. So how do you deliver on customer expectations and their values? How do you align yourself to that? People, so delivering long-term value to people, so your employees, your partners, your suppliers, and then lastly to society at large.
Okay, yeah, I'll take over. Sorry. So let me just maximize this screen. And so the last characteristic is leadership anchored in the human imperative. And so, leads with compassion, and this relates to empathy, because to have compassion, you have to have empathy. And so understanding, approaching business challenges from the customer's perspective, but also your employees' perspective, in order to be able to enable those employees to deliver the customer outcomes that you want. To drive the kind of experimentation and risk-taking, the CEO needs to exemplify that, and then also to drive a transformative mindset. And when we look at some of the other data, so 89% agree that the CEO must lead disruptive innovation and business reimagination. And then 80% agree that establishing stakeholder trust will become an increasingly important part of the CEO's job. So making that human-centered decisions, so both for your customers and their challenges, and developing trust in order to be able to deliver those data-driven experiences that are so important, because without trust, you can't acquire and maintain and deliver those the data for those experiences. But then also trust from your employees that you're going to be able, that you have empathy for their challenges, and you can approach business solutions through the prism of their challenges, so that they can deliver for the customer.
John, thank you. I apologize, everybody. I got cut off here. My internet is apparently not very strong today. Thanks, John. Sorry.
Thanks.
I think you wrapped up on this particular slide, so maybe we move ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. And so this is really the crux of the how, right? Is if these are the 5 pillars of the successful future enterprise, then what is it going to take to get there? How do we achieve that success? How do we transform to achieve that success? And I think, ultimately transformation is about improving the human condition. And so we really start this journey with humans at center. And this is about, radical customer centricity, and also radical employee centricity, radical human centricity, as it were, to put the human impact at the heart of every decision that gets made, every strategic choice that gets made, and understanding the impact of that before executing. And this is, especially so in the case of embracing new technologies. We saw sort of, one of the big strategic focuses of the C-suite being AI and data science, and we're all aware of the ethical risks of AI. And so really trying to understand what it means to embed and embrace AI and data science, and what that impact is on the human experience is going to be extremely important as you orchestrate the transformation and look to leverage data as a strategic and operational enabler. And then I think, of course, given the level of the level of digitization, the emphasis on the digital and virtual experience, technology at speed is going to be tremendously important in the transformation journey, in this journey of continuous transformation, as it were. Now, although leveraging, it's not just about leveraging technology, in our opinion. It's also about creatively deploying it and doing that faster. That's going to be critical. And again, keeping the human dimension at the heart of that decision making, of how you're leveraging that technology, how you're deploying it, what is the impact of, what are the first and second order impacts of deploying that technology is going to be critical. And then third, I think, not last but not least, certainly is thoughtfully scaling innovation. And the reason we put thoughtful in there is, again, to embed the human imperative, the human dimension into the innovation process. Ultimately, innovation is about people. It's about harnessing their ideas. It's about giving permission to take risk and execute. It's about cultivating an agile innovation competency, and not just within the company, but also nurturing innovation with ecosystem partners, because they can show you sometimes pain points that you would not be able to see within your own company, within your own industry, your own customer base. And then also, the ability to commercialize and move quickly into new markets is, again, a really a human driven ability, competency. And we believe that putting these three value drivers together at the heart of your transformation journey is going to allow you to achieve those five characteristics of the future successful enterprise. And then, let me just also wrap up quickly about, to take a little view about what does this entail? How do we go through this process? And one of the things that we at EY have been trying to do with our customers is taking what we call a future back approach. Because look, if you take a step back and you really look at what's going on here, we're basically jumping S curves. We're going from the previous S curve to the next one, which, granted, has been in the making for a number of years, but the pandemic has just, so to speak, push us over the cliff, right? And so when we want to move into this better world S curve, so to speak, how do we do that? How do we get there? And part of it is to take this future back approach, to take a minute to understand what is it going to take for my company to be relevant and successful in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And looking at the scenarios that could happen in those 5, 10, 15-year timeframes, and working backwards into what do I need to do today to set myself up for success in these timeframes. And that we find, including the transformation value drivers and this particular part of the innovation and transformation journey, this is the path to business transformation, and it really starts with a view from the future. Now, I'll just wrap up quickly by saying that this is not an easy task, right? Not for any CEO anywhere. This is ambitious. This is difficult, and certainly in a moment of great upheaval and crisis. But we believe that if we can take a step back and think about how to root the transformation in the human experience, and take that mindset of continuous transformation and adopt a mindset of impatience and dissatisfaction, to continuously improve and make things better. We believe that this is the path to success and transformation, into the future enterprise, for CEOs today. This is the bridge that you'll have to cross, and we hope that some of what we've shown you today helps to frame that. And yeah, we're open to questions, and yeah, want to say thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So there's a few comments that I wanted to point out. Rick Francie says, taking time to think about the unthinkable would have been a good characteristic for a leader when considering the possible impact of COVID-19 on their business early into the pandemic. And I think that kind of goes, I just wanted to touch on that and talk a little bit about maybe how can CEOs and leaders really start to make the time for that. So I think that so much is happening so fast that a lot of our leaders are struggling to really carve out the time for that and think about the unthinkable. And that has such a direct relationship to innovation. And so how have you seen leaders start to do that? What have they started to kind of implement within their teams that are working for them, and getting to that future back approach as well? I think that's really connected to, making the time.
Well, one dimension of this is to, in a way, get out of your bubble and to make connections outside of the ones that you would normally make. And so it's oftentimes less so much about creating a specific time, but creating a new way of work, or a new way of interacting. So can you bring the outside in new ways? So you interact with your C-suite and you interact with your board, but can you interact with people who are lower in your organization, people who you normally wouldn't interact with? And then also, can you get out and bring the outside in new ways, keeping in mind that thinking in the unthinkable. So it's less about I need to think what the unthinkable is, but it's more about broadening your perspectives, broadening the types of perspectives that you bring in that will inform that and give you those aha moments, rather than sort of I must schedule 30 minutes next week to think the unthinkable.
Yeah, it's certainly about forming a new habit. It's certainly about making it to wake up and brush your teeth in the morning, right? It's certainly a little bit like that, of embedding it into a habit. One thing that I've seen is that actually during the course of our research, and a number of people that we interviewed, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was having the CEO actually walk the customer journey and be at that front end. Because what it does is it takes you away from the day-to-day operation, and it puts you in the shoes of the customer, and you start to think about not only the journey the customer is taking with your product or service, but start to think about all the other things that are impacting them. And that's another way to get at the to think really beyond your four walls, and push your boundaries a little bit. I think what John said as well is really bringing that diversity of perspectives. People that you would never think of partnering with. And I think that is part of it, is putting yourself in a position to open up the mind to say, okay, I'm a pharmaceutical company. Let me go talk to an architect and understand what's happening in architecture. I don't know, right? But things like that, I think, will help to illuminate new opportunities.
Great. And all of this kind of brings me to this idea of, so there was another question in the chat that had to do with sort of this idea of tech and people. And how do you see, if we're talking about technology, if we're talking about people, if we're talking about innovation, the role of managers and that leadership team and the people that are, the game changers for, and making sure that all of this is kind of, they're bringing up the teams with us on this vision. We're bringing up those ideas. We're being agile. How do you guys see the role of the manager kind of changing? I mean, we've got remote teams now. We want them to be agile, future thinking. How how does that change from sort of a traditional role of the past into what we're trying to look for moving forward in terms of profiles, in terms of leaderships?
Yes.
Go ahead, John.
So one of the things that we identify as CEOs affirm in the survey is that empathy and soft skills are going to come to the fore as value drivers, and so that and by empathy it's putting yourself, seeing the challenges through the eyes of your team or your employees or your customer, and being able to manage or develop a solution that addresses those challenges of through their prism. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is, to this idea about soft skills is you have to, more than ever, I think, model the behaviors that you want to drive in your team. So the teams look to you, and so what is your personal say-do gap, right? So we all have aspirations for the kinds of leaders that we want to be, but more than ever, it's important to close that gap between the say and the do, and then also taking a hard look at incentives, and how those incentives are driving behaviors. And so, are you asking your team to do one thing but incenting them to do another, and then looking at your own incentives and try to bridge those potential dichotomy. The company wants me to go one way, but I'm incented with my metrics and rewards in another way. It's not easy, but those are the sorts of challenges that I think managers need to contend with.
One thing I will say, and sort of in response to this, but also a little bit more in response to the previous question, Carrie-Anne, is I think management has to be about enabling and unlocking the potential of the employee, and sparking that magic, that creativity, that confidence in the person. And I think that is part of the soft skills and the empathy. A lot of it is going to be about you have to understand the whole person, right? This is not just your employee. This might be a father, a mother, a daughter, a son, right? And that whole person comes to work. And in the world that we are now living in with remote work and sort of the extreme blurring of boundaries between work and personal life, acknowledging that whole person is going to be really important, not just for motivation, but also for loyalty. And believe me, in the world of remote work, I think it's going to be easier and easier for employees to just leave when they're done, because there's no longer those boundaries, So you really have to think of the manager as, to some extent, a confidant. And to take on that role is a huge responsibility, and that type of, to me, that's really the crux of it. It's very personal, it's very human, and that's something we're not used to in the business world, and that's going to change. And that's where really, honestly, a lot of technology comes into play as well in helping to understand that and helping to enable that. And I think we're just going to see more and more of it. The one thing I wanted to say about the previous question about the think the unthinkable, and I'm sorry it slipped my mind, is another person we interviewed said to me that you take a team, you carve them out, you put them aside, and you say, go figure out how you're going to disrupt my company. That is thinking the unthinkable without actually having to do it, really. You go and pick a bunch of people and say, hey, go figure out how you're going to put my company out of business. And then you take that and you say, okay, guys, now go create this, operationalize it, and that's your next product that helps you jump that S-curve, frankly, right? It takes a lot of guts to do that. It takes a lot of risk to do that, and it takes, it really takes a very involved CEO to do that, because that then becomes your SWAT team, and you are in charge of that team. You have to provide the air cover. You have to set the limits, but to me, that's such an efficient and creative way of going out there to scan the risks that you're not frankly seeing, that you're not seeing the two guys in a garage somewhere, coming up with the next product to completely decimate your industry, So yeah, just wanted to add that in. I thought it was a really interesting anecdote. You're on mute, Carrie-Anne.
Oh, thank you. No, that's great. Thank you so much for these insights. We're at time, so I'm not going to continue with the questions at this point. I just want to remind everyone that the recording of this and the presentation will be available to members on the digital resource platform. I want to thank John and Priyanka for being with us today. And I want to challenge all of our listeners and all of our members to start looking at, their say and their do gap. I think that this is an amazing takeaway. It's something concrete and actionable. And I will be also with the presentation, we will give them access to the article that you wrote that talks about each one of these things more in detail and that offers additional resources within UI as well, as we dive deeper into these topics and get ready for what's coming next. So thank you, John and Priyanka, for being with us today. Thank you for everyone watching.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.